I invite the first panel, members of the first panelists to come on up and take a seat. Jodie Marshall, Fran Fay, right, and Kinaya Hassane, as well as Elizabeth Giorgis, who will be the discussant. This first panel is titled Women, Feminism in the Indian Ocean. It features presentations by Kinaya Hassane, who's presenting on the topic of archival entropy, tracing the photographic representations of Djoumbé, Fatima. Then we'll hear from Jodie Marshall on women and the creation of Omani-Swahili identity. And finally, Fran Fay on the Indian Ocean as a feminist aesthetic space, thinking with Lubaina, Himid's contemporary practice. And after that, you will have a discussant by Elizabeth Giorgis. Without further ado.
Good morning. First of all, I would like to thank Prita, Professor Fair, and everyone at the Africa Institute for providing the space to present and receive feedback on this work in progress. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to share my work and to be in conversation with my co-panelists and Professor Giorgis. Today, I will be discussing the photographic representations of Djoumbé Fatima. Djoumbé Fatima was a Comorian queen who ruled over the island of U.A.E. during the mid-19th century. Over the course of her reign, she negotiated the competing interests of France and the Omani Sultanate of Zanzibar. She also posed for several photographic portraits that spawned a dizzying array of artistic reinterpretations in the French printed press. These depictions of Djoumbé Fatima have also gone on to live rich digital afterlives in which she is molded into a consciously Black, feminist, and anti-colonial hero. When I first came across the images of her, I was immediately drawn to the story of Djoumbé Fatima and wanted desperately to unravel her history, especially since I'm a woman of Comorian descent, living in diaspora, which is an experience that had often left me feeling untethered from the island's history and culture. However, the more I tried to square these visual depictions of the queen with written accounts of her life, the less I felt I knew about her. This presentation sits with the dissonances that I encountered in an attempt to show how representations of Djoumbé Fatima exhibit the tenuous relationship between photographs and the truth. Circling around this work are the following questions. What do we make of the entropy that colonial photographs enact? And how might scholars make this disarray useful or productive? Scholarship by Africanist thinkers across disciplines have been profoundly influential for me in this attempt to understand the slipperiness of photographic truth. Historian Paul Landau has articulated photography's distancing effect, which in turn makes so-called African authenticity something that is, quote, always in retreat and recedes from view. Art historian Prita Meyer's work has also been foundational for this project, as she has rigorously worked to undo the presumed relationship between portraits and their sitter's interiority in images like the A.C. Gomez photograph shown on the right. Accepting the disorderliness and imprecision of photographs like these ones can help disrupt the impulse to narrowly read them as positive expressions of agency and resistance. Such interpretations fall short of recognizing that both of these women were entangled in histories of slavery and empire that preclude a straightforward reading of their agency. A more capacious understanding of these women's abilities to make choices and present themselves to the world must also hold space for expressions of agency that are more elusive and difficult to perceive. Ultimately, carving out room for these multiplicities can provide entry points into these women's lives that are more in step with what it means to live in a dynamic and ever-changing historical moment. Djoumbé Fatima was born in 1835 on the island of U.A.E., the smallest of the four that make up the Comorian archipelago. Her parents, Ramanataka and Rovao, belonged to the Marana royal family of Madagascar. In 1828, Ramanataka was forced to flee from his homeland upon the ascension of Queen Ranavalana, who sought ruthlessly to eliminate her political enemies after taking the throne. Ramanataka subsequently migrated to U.A.E. and usurped power from local leaders with support from Sultan Abdullah of the neighboring island of Nzwani. After Ramanataka's death, Djoumbé Fatima ascended to the throne with her mother Rovau ruling as regent. Rovau's second husband, Sivadini, who was also a member of the Marina elite, initiated the family's conversion to Islam and attempted to consult and educate his stepdaughter. However, after Rovau and Sivadini's divorce in 1847, the French, who were in the midst of expanding their colonial influence in the Indian Ocean, intervened in Djoumbé Fatima's education by bringing a governess to Mouali for her. They also planned her coronation in 1849, signaling their overt desire to turn Djoumbé Fatima into a compliant ruler who would one day cede the island to them. Years later, however, Djoumbé Fatima ousted her governess and married her first husband, Said Mohamed Nasser Mqadar, a relative of the Busaidi Sultan in Zanzibar. The French then retaliated in 1860 by expelling Mqadar from Mouali. This photograph of Djoumbé Fatima was taken by the French colonial explorer Désiré Charnay in the aftermath of this expulsion. The image shows Djoumbé Fatima seated at the center of a careful arrangement and covered head to toe with luxurious finery. On either side of her are enslaved female attendants, one of whom holds a small boy, who is likely the queen's young son, Muhammad. Muhammad's face registers on the print as a blur, suggesting that he was perhaps fitfully wrangled to pose for the image. Despite this brief rupture and gateway into the quotidian tenor of the moment that it captures, the photograph bears a tight composition that forms a continuous screen across the image, heightening its subject's impenetrable aura. Her decision to dress in the style of elite Arab women from the Swahili coast for this occasion is significant, as the photograph came in the wake of France and the Omani Sultanate's ongoing struggle over the Comorian archipelago. At the same time, this particular instance of apparent visual resistance cannot be unquestioningly expanded beyond the historical contingencies that produced it, particularly since the balance of scales would continue to shift in the region. At this point, I would like to briefly pivot from the images to further narrate the changing dynamics on Mouali that would greatly impact the trajectory of Djoumbé Fatima's life. The arrival of Joseph Lambert, a Frenchman who came to Mouali by way of Madagascar, would destabilize the existing order on the island and set off a chain of events that would bring Djoumbé Fatima to France. Prior to this time on Mouali, Lambert convinced Prince Radama II to grant him a charter to take over Malagasy mines and establish plantations on the island. The prince's assassination in 1863 resulted in the revocation of Lambert's land rights, and he was forced to flee to Mouali in 1865, where he tried to realize his entrepreneurial ambitions again. The introduction of Lambert onto the already fraught political stage added yet another layer of complexity to the ongoing tripartite relations between Djoumbé Fatima, France, and the Omani Sultanate. Once he gained the queen's confidence, Lambert was able to convince her to marry her second husband, Said Omar al-Masala, in a strategic alliance that helped the French establish a stronger foothold on Mouali. Shortly thereafter, Lambert and Djoumbé Fatima began a romantic relationship. He also implored the queen to grant him exclusive rights to Mouali's arable land. This development incensed the Omani Sultanate, who descended on the island with the goal of convincing Djoumbé Fatima to renege on the succession to Lambert. They eventually persuaded her to abdicate the throne for her son Muhammad as a means of nullifying the deal. In addition to obliging the Omani's demands, Djoumbé Fatima cut Lambert off politically and romantically. She also began an intimate relationship with a member of the Omani delegation. Lambert, however, refused to leave the island and attempted to ingratiate himself with the young sovereign Muhammad. This prompted Djoumbé Fatima and the representatives of the Omani Sultanate to travel to France to seek help in pushing Lambert out of Mouali. Upon her arrival in Marseille aboard the Ripon, a British vessel, Djoumbé Fatima had her first portrait taken in the studio of Camille Briand. The photograph was subsequently reproduced as an engraving on the front page of Le Monde Illustré on July 18, 1868. The artists, Émile Boncourt and Léon Louis Chapon, show Djoumbé Fatima standing beside a table. Rather than facing the viewer head-on, she is positioned at a slight angle, and she casts her gaze into the distance. A striped ukaya fabric and metal pendant frame her face. Both adornments are held in place by a round headband that sits atop the crown of her head. She dons several piercings on her ear and a large beaded necklace with a circular medallion. Her long shirt drapes down to sit just above her ankles, and barely visible are a pair of flared Marinda pants. One hand rests on the table while the other holds together a fringed shawl wrapped carefully around her shoulder and torso. Her lips are slightly puckered, and the muscles in her cheeks and chin are taut, lending an unreadability to her facial expression that is compounded by her arched, slightly raised eyebrows. On one hand, this photograph seemingly reveals more of Djoumbé Fatima than Charnay's earlier depiction of the fully veiled queen. However, its staging and her enigmatic presence thwart a straightforward assessment of her interiority at this moment of political and personal crisis. At this point in time, her stance toward the burgeoning French colonial authority wavered between defiance and acquiescence. Juxtaposed against the earlier photograph by Charnay, this image implores us to understand Djoumbé Fatima's decision-making on the register of both the political and sartorial as necessarily inconsistent and contingent. 8 days after its recirculation as a print, the photograph became the basis for a slew of racist and misogynistic caricatures that circulated for the duration of Djoumbé Fatima's visit. L'Eclipse, a controversial French magazine that drew the ire of Napoleon III and was subject to frequent censure, published illustrator André Gille's depiction of Djoumbé Fatima on its cover. She is shown in the same attire as the Briand photograph, but what was likely intended to be a dignified image has been distorted to advance virulent racism. Rather than standing tall, Djoumbé Fatima is shown hunched over an overflowing chest that bears a label with her name. She grips the top of the chest with one hand and a saber in the other to steady herself. A satirical poem below the image plays up stereotypes of a despotic leader from the Dark Continent. The third image on this slide, which I showed earlier in the presentation, was created after Djoumbé Fatima and her entourage arrived in Paris at the studio of Antoine-René Trancard, who photographed many prominent public figures during the 19th century. Without access to the exact date on which the photograph was taken, we can't possibly know whether it was taken and subsequently circulated as a rebuttal to Gille's insulting rendering of the Queen. Its reproduction in the highly mobile and easily circulated format of the carte de visite certainly suggests an awareness of the rhetorical power of the image when reproduced en masse. Further, she poses with her elbow resting on the prop column beside her and her gaze trained directly on the camera's lens. Read alongside predominant discourses on identity, wherein proponents of diversity place a premium on visibility and representation as tools of resistance, this portrait marks an act of forceful refusal on the part of Djoumbé Fatima. Together, however, these images embody what we might understand as the unstable truth of the photographic likeness, which can be coaxed into producing multiple disparate realities and falsehoods around a subject. Other photographs that were most likely taken at Trancard's studio during the same session, a claim supported by the recurrence of certain props and the backdrop, put pressure on a singularly empowering reading of Djoumbé Fatima's depictions and self-presentation. These depictions plot yet another moment of uncertain guesswork, as they were compiled in an album by the Anthropological Society of Paris titled Asia, Asia Minor, Arabia, Corsica, Afghanistan, the East Indies, and Indochina. The photographs show Djoumbé Fatima and an unidentified man who is only described as the Prince of U.A.E, both of whom are slotted under the broad category of the East Indies by the Anthropological Society's cataloger. In addition to ascribing a vague and dubious ethnic marker onto the pair, the album's collector has most likely misidentified the man who accompanied Fatima to the studio and on this trip to France. The Prince of U.A.E would ostensibly be Fatima's then-husband, Saïd Omar Mosela. However, he returned to the island of Maore promptly after the political union. The man pictured here could therefore be one of the members of the Omani delegation that accompanied her to France. It is especially possible that it was her lover, Saif. This misidentification of the relationship between the sitters is twinned with a caricature of Djoumbé Fatima that was published the same year and lampoons her successive intimate partnerships. Like the second Trancard photograph, the cartoon by Albert Robida shows Djoumbé Fatima seated in front of a table. Splayed out before her in the cartoon, however, are numerous carte de visite photographs. A biting satirical caption below the image facetiously announces that Djoumbé Fatima is in search of a new partner, and the narrator encourages young Frenchmen to submit carte de visite portraits for consideration. Across these depictions, Djoumbé Fatima's sexuality and apparent autonomy are purposefully corralled with the aim of cutting her down to size. In the Trancard photographs, she and Saif are reduced to ethnographic objects of study, and their relationship is rendered illegible in the face of these totalizing designs. Meanwhile, in the cartoon, her relative independence and agency, and perhaps even her well-documented engagement with the photographic medium, are the butt of a joke, one that plays on tropes of Black women's promiscuity and their ravenous desire for white European men. Rather than converging on a particular truth about Djoumbé Fatima, these images, along with the others that were brought into view in this presentation, show how photographs, despite their verisimilitude, oftentimes produce meanings that are diffuse and expansive in nature. Projects of attempting to marshal them as evidence of truth and as evidence and truth claims thus run the risk of painting a flattening image of historical subjects. So instead of attempting to excavate images in search of the real, it is necessary to sit in the interstices of these many disorienting fictions to understand how women in the African Indian Ocean were caught in the crosshairs of global forces while participating in the everyday practice of constructing a self. Thank you.
Good morning, sabah khair. I'm going to share today a microhistory about women's social labor in maintaining and recreating Omani-Zanzibari transnational community in the decades following the 1964 Zanzibar Revolution. This microhistory follows multiple generations of two families who live both down the street from each other in the town of Chake Chake on the Tanzanian island of Pemba, while both also trying with various degrees of success to keep contact with family in Oman. Through this microhistory, I intend to explore the ways that women, particularly working-class Pemban women with various family connections to Oman, were crucial actors in the process of creating opportunities for connection between Omani and Pemban branches of their family, principally via successive generations of mothers making active choices for the well-being of their children. So these two families are drawn from the interviews that were part of a larger project about the social history of migration between Zanzibari archipelago and Oman. And I chose these two microhistories primarily because they seem to me generally representative of the trends that I noticed across my larger group of interviews. That is, I should say, in as much as an individual's life story can be seen as representative. But putting these two family histories together, I hope that some of the ways that they draw from the same patterns can be seen today. So some notes. I tend to use Zanzibar to refer to the entire archipelago and Pemba and Unguja, respectively, to differentiate between the two islands. Also, there's a lot of names in this paper, and how everyone is related to each other gets really confusing really fast, so I'll try to spell out relations whenever someone new comes up. Everyone's names, according to the wishes of my informants, have been anonymized, but we're going to call my two principal interlocutors Fatima and Saidi. Fatima and Saidi have lived in the same neighborhood of Chake Chake as each other their entire lives. They were both raised by single mothers who were themselves from Chake Chake and whose husbands, both of whom were from Oman, had either died or left Zanzibar in the wake of the 1964 revolution. And it was principally about their mothers' lives that they spoke to me about in their interviews. So Fatma's mother, let's call her Maria, had no personal family connections to Oman prior to marrying Fatma's father, roughly sometime in the 1950s. He had come to Pemba several years prior with his sister, and who himself had no prior family connection to East Africa. Saidi's mother, who we're going to call Maimuna, it's complicated, but the simplified version that we have time for is that she has a co-wife who we're going to call Aisha. And Aisha lived in Muscat, Maimuna lives in Chake Chake, and their husband, prior to the revolution, went back and forth between their two houses with some regularity. So the turning point for these two families, and our starting point today, was the 1964 revolution. Maria's husband died in the aftermath, and his sister left to return to Oman. His family in Oman wanted her to also send the children to then be raised by their paternal grandparents in Muscat, but Maria chose to keep them with her in Chake. Meanwhile, Maimuna's husband had happened to be staying in Oman with his Omani wife Aisha at the time, and he simply never returned. So in the decades immediately following the revolution, while thousands of Arab Zanzibaris were migrating first away from the pogroms of the aftermath of the revolution in Zanzibar, and then towards Oman in the midst of Sultan Qaboos's new open-door policies towards those with Omani heritage, gender was arguably the most salient variable affecting individual Zanzibaris' access to mobility. The legal, economic, and social barriers to mobility that were common amongst all of my interviews were each individually more of a barrier for women. For example, until the 1990s, the Omani policy considered women to be the dependents of their male family members, and therefore women needed the permission of their husbands or fathers if they were unmarried to enter the country. Similarly, employment prospects that paid for and incentivized male migration in the following decades, such as in the oil industry and in the Omani government, were not nearly as open to women. And for women in particular, children limited mobility. For example, one man in an interview about his grandmother's life said that she would have found it difficult to move anywhere while raising a young child. He said, quote, "My father was born in 1961, so when the revolution came, she stayed in the same village." And he's referencing here the difficulty both of moving with a young child, but then also raising a child away from the support structures that she had in Zanzibar. So I emphasize the limitations on women's mobility, not because there weren't many Zanzibari Arab women who did, in fact, emigrate in the aftermath of the revolution. There certainly were, but rather because the fact that a disproportionate number of women in particular with ties to Oman, either through marriage or through lineage, stayed in Zanzibar, then set them up for their role in the history of Zanzibari Omani community networks following the revolution. Specifically that of linchpins of transnational social and familial connections in the post-revolution period of Zanzibari history. So at this point, Maria's and Maimuna's trajectories start to diverge, so I'll address them somewhat separately. For both their stories, however, what we can see in the next several decades is a story of the various ways that the women of these two families have tried to do right for their children. And thus they've made different decisions that have had lasting impact on the various ways that they and their children and even their grandchildren have understood their Swahili Arab identity and belonging. So for Maria, the following decades were characterized by successive generations of women striving to create connections to Oman from their children, for their children from afar, for a variety of emotive and material reasons. And against the urging of her husband's Omani family, Maria chose to keep her children with her and her family in Chake. So wrapped up in women's mobility is their children's mobility, and the amount of agency that individual women had to make decisions for their children varied a lot. I'm going to cut this paragraph for time, but essentially I give an example of a woman who had her children straight up kidnapped, and another woman who actively tried to and successfully get her husband to take her children to Oman to give them a better life. Both two telling examples, but Maria's decision is a third path. She had the agency to decide and actively chose to keep her children in Pemba. And her daughter Fatima, who I interviewed, she feels somewhat bitter about her mother's decision. She says, quote, "We missed our opportunity to go to Oman. But in the early 1970s, when her mother was making that decision, she had really good reasons for it. Maria's own parents and extended family were in Chake, keeping her children with her where she could care for them personally and where she had her community as a source of support would certainly have been an obvious good option when compared to trusting them to the care of a family in Oman who she had never met, gambling not only on their goodwill, but on her husband's family's good fortune in a rapidly changing Oman. And it's clear from my interview with Fatima that her mother tried her best to teach her children about their Omani heritage and to keep the memory of their deceased father alive. Fatima presents herself as an Arab Zanzibari, which she is. She keeps a picture of Sultan Qaboos on her wall. She uses first person to describe our Omani history. And not to mention, she volunteered herself to be interviewed by a researcher asking to talk about people with family connections to Oman. Less successful, however, were Fatima's efforts to actually remember many details about her late husband's family. Everything from where in Oman they were from to how to contact them has been lost to time, much to Fatima's grief, who told me with a somewhat mournful tone that her family in Oman, quote, are dead. Even if they're not dead, they are dead, essentially because she cannot, in fact, get in contact with them. So now, a whole generation later, Maria's efforts to raise her children, knowing their Omani heritage and being a part of the Omani-Zanzibari international community, have been joined by Fatima's own efforts for her children's parts. So for Fatima, this principally means several decades-long search for a way to get in contact with her father's family. I pressed her in our interview to explain why it was so important to her to contact this branch of her family. She brought up several different reasons. First, she said, quote, I don't have the strength anymore. I have 9 children, end quote. So here she's somewhat euphemistically referring to her need for material support for herself and her children. She later confirmed, I need help. And her hope that a relative in Oman would be willing to send such help. Many Arab Zanzibaris are deeply reliant on family abroad, and Oman is continuing to invest heavily in the well-being of their Tanzanian relations. So for her, finding a long-lost family member in Oman who would be willing to send remittances or gifts, school fees, etc., would not only be potentially life-changing, but seems like a very realistic option. However, it's not only the potential for material advancement that motivates her. Another reason she gave for why it was important for her to locate her family in Oman was, quote, I don't know my elders. And she reinforced this longing for a connection and to knowledge about her cultural heritage, largely through speaking about her children and the ways that she wants them to, quote, know their elders. She recounted multiple times that her children ask her about their family history and want to know about their relatives in Oman. She said, quote, they ask the same questions as you do. Where are they from? Where do they live now? What are their names? I don't know. I only know that our tribe is Nasser, and that is all I know. Even now, we write letters, but we don't get any information back about our family in Oman, end quote. So Fatima and Maria have now spent decades searching for these missing relatives. And her principal way of searching is to ask friends and neighbors who have been to Oman, did you see our village? Did you see our family? But in truth, we don't know anything, end quote. How, I hear some of you thinking, do they ask for details about their family and village when they don't know what village or even the names of their relatives? I also wanted to know this. Fatima said that they have old pictures, and those pictures are now 2 generations out of date, that they show people, and she added, essentially repeating my own question back to me, quote, the problem is that no one really knows the names of who we are looking for or where they might live. So nevertheless, they have made at least 2 major efforts to locate these unknown relations. First, in the late 1980s, their neighbor Binti Mohammed moved from Pemba to Muscat, and she is still semi-regularly in contact with Fatima and Maria, and it is to her that Fatima sends her letters to Oman, and asking for Binti Mohammed to find their family, and she's sending them copies of these old photographs to help in the search. Second, and slightly more recently, Fatima's daughter's husband has family in Oman, and the daughter's husband's sister lives in Oman and has been trying to locate this long-lost family for them for about a decade now. These methods that she described were very common among my interviews in both Oman and Zanzibar. Many of those who are able to travel go themselves to look. For example, one interviewee told me, quote, one year I went to Oman, and when I went there, most of our relatives had already died. There remained only one woman, and she is blind. But for many others, they're unable to buy the plane ticket to themselves, go look for their relatives who might not even be there to be found. So they deputize those already traveling in between. And this is true for both of my interviewees living in Zanzibar and those living in Oman. What's notable in many of my interviews is that the majority of these contacts abroad, approximately 2/3, were women. An aunt most often, sometimes a daughter or a sister, or in the case of Fatma's search, the former neighbor, Binti Mohammed, and the daughter's husband's sister. This is at least suggestive to me of an informal and transnational social network between women, loosely connected by bonds of relation and social connection. And the social labor that these women are doing keep this community in touch, to keep this community in touch, is also on display if we turn back to Maimuna's family. So sometime in the 1980s or so, Maimuna's husband died in Oman with her and her children still living in Pemba, and her co-wife, Aisha, if you recall, and her children living in Muscat. So since his death, Maimuna and her co-wife have been working to keep this familial connection alive for their children's generation. Maimuna's son, Saidi, the one who I interviewed, explained several such occasions. He said at various points in the final several decades of their lives, so roughly the 1980s to the 2010s, Aisha has traveled with her daughter's husband to come visit Maimuna and her children in Zanzibar. Aisha also arranged for Saidi to come stay with her for some time in Oman, and there she introduced him to the woman who would later become his wife. Maimuna and Aisha together arranged for several of Maimuna's daughters to move to Oman. He added that in recent years, prior to her death, Aisha had been trying to convince him to move to Oman after he retires, but he's planning on staying in Zanzibar because his children and grandchildren are there. This struck me as a somewhat extraordinary amount of organization for family togetherness for two women who had never met prior to Aisha's first visit, and who don't actually share a common language, thank you, but get by with the translating help of various children and relatives. So why, I asked, did she arrange for that first visit? And Saidi says, so that my sister could know her brother. She told her sister's husband, you must do this for your wife, so your wife can know her brothers. And the later trips, I asked? He said, well, we are family. And for Maimuna and Aisha, both of whom very confusingly he refers to as my mother, that seems to be enough. I have a whole section about women teaching their children Swahili that I'm going to skip because I'm out of time. To wrap this up to some sort of conclusion, I'll say that in the histories of Omani-Zanzibari transnational communities and migration, there have been lately a handful of calls to include women. But I've been thinking, what does this actually mean? Which women do we include? And how does this affect how we are framing their roles in history? So speaking to a historiography that has tended to include women who go against the norm, either by being super elite or by breaking gender norms in some way, I would suggest that perhaps what is missing from our analysis of gendered Arab migration in East Africa is close enough attention to class. And while the lives of the most elite women and those plucky women who can gesture to also migrating via dhows alongside men certainly are very worthy of study, what we are missing is both the inclusion of less elite women such as Maimuna and Maria and Fatima, etc., and an attention to the ways that these women who perhaps lacked access to independent mobility were nonetheless essential to the creation and maintenance of this migratory community. And ultimately, I argue that in this paper is that the emotional, logistical, and social labor of the ordinary, working class, and well-behaved women performed in their role as good wives, good mothers, and aunties has in fact been quite critical in the creation of an Omani-Zanzibari transnational community in the post-revolution period. Thank you.
Thank you so much to everybody at the Africa Institute. Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Preeta, for having me. It's a true pleasure to be here. There could be an endless ocean was the piece I saw first when I entered Lubaina Himid's largest recent solo exhibition to date at the Tate Modern in London in November 21. I found myself looking up at her critical reinterpretation of the foundational map of East African kanga cloth that was hanging from the ceiling, amid what appears as two lungs at the center and framed by maybe light blue shores with a network of archipelagos of darker blue dots across them, the probe. There could be an endless ocean. I remember standing there for a while before entering the main exhibition, wondering about the could and the gendered nature of the canvas of her choice, as if this reminder was meant for me specifically. Remember, there could be an endless ocean if what? What would the world have to be in order for the ocean to be or to become endless? For a body of water like the Indian Ocean to exist inclusively through the water that is first and foremost constituted of all the bodies of water, as multidisciplinary artist Phoebe Boswell has recently put it, as she writes, who are both repositories of painful historical experience and sites of renewal and hope. I want to begin my brief reflection today on the generative potential of my suggestion to understand the Indian Ocean as a feminist aesthetic space with this moment of pause that did to me what I hope my thinking with Zanzibari British artist, activist, and professor of contemporary art, Lubaina Himid's paintings may do for you as Indian Ocean scholars too. And I add a comment she put forward in an interview from 2013. My work, Himid writes, is very rarely discussed in the context of contemporary practice. No one is interested in talking about it for its aesthetic value. So there is no dialogue about this anywhere for me to respond to. I'm not a painter in the strictest sense. I didn't train as a painter. I'm not obsessed by the stuff of it, though I do use paint and I do paint things. I'm a political strategist who uses a visual language to encourage conversation, argument, and change. My own role as a political anthropologist who engages with feminist theories and works on Zanzibar, Tanzania, and Swahili-speaking Oman, I'm particularly interested in this notion of the political strategist, especially when this is an art practitioner who, as Julia Verne, for example, has put it, also carries the ocean with her, and thus also operates as an aesthetic activist whose strategizing may bring critical insights to our theorizing and do much for ongoing conversations on the limitations of notions like that of the so-called Indian Ocean. For this purpose, I want to ask, how does our theorizing of the Indian Ocean change when we consider it through the lens of a feminist aesthetic space? What can the aesthetic value of artistic intervention or political strategizing through arts tell us about the entrenched margins of Indian Ocean theory? And I argue that a robust understanding of the interwoven worlds of art and culture in the Western Indian Ocean needs a decidedly intersectional orientation in order to refrain from reinscribing those omissions that aesthetic activists like Himid have long critiqued through their contemporary practice. My intervention is intended as a response to Himid's lament regarding this neglected dimension of her body of work, namely discussing its aesthetic value, or put differently, what her art, her visual language does or may do to encourage conversation, argument, and change. So for the next 15 minutes or so, I want to explore the potential implications of Himid's idea of the possibility of an endless ocean through this lens of the feminist aesthetic space by way of some of her works and in light of a potential tide change for Indian Ocean studies. The Indian Ocean as aesthetic space. Now, before turning to Himid's practice, let me sketch out some of the aspects that make up my thinking about how we may understand this idea of a feminist aesthetic space in the context of thinking across Indian Ocean worlds, and specifically with more recent debate. As a starting point, I take my colleagues at the University of Mainz, Markus Werner and Julia Werner's critical intervention from 2017, where in comparative studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, they curated a special section on the Indian Ocean as aesthetic space, which, of course, Prita, you are a part of as well. Herein, they argue for thinking about Indian Ocean worlds as a space characterized by and constituted through translocal aesthetic practices, and by taking into account the aesthetic experiences of those we try to understand, through, for example, their poetry, tarab, oceanic objects. More specifically, they suggest a theoretical reconfiguration of the space we refer to as the Indian Ocean by grasping it as A, an empirical space that emerges from the translocal distribution of artful practices, and B, as a space constituted through central experience. So in what follows, I will suggest that it is precisely the artful practices by Lubaina Himid and the sensual experiences invoked in and through them that can help direct our attention with Werner's words, to the less tangible, more mundane, but emotionally relevant connections tying together the Indian Ocean. And in order to do this intersectionally, however, I suggest it is necessary to expand this notion of Werner and Werner, of the Indian Ocean as an aesthetic space, to imagine it more specifically in feminist terms. Now, particularly the last 2 years seem to have brought about a new wave of thinking with the ocean across feminist research, of feminist theorizing for Indian Ocean studies, more specifically, and of contemporary feminist spatial practice, both in and outside the academy. In the Feminist Review special issue on oceans from last year, for example, Heathcote, Gedalef, and Hoare have argued oceans challenge and change feminist research, the sites and forms of knowledge production, and, not to mention, the ground beneath our feet. They express the need to make visible in foreground, quote, the forgotten, erased, and inaudible voices that otherwise fall out of the visible spaces of the vast, volatile histories of seafaring journeys. An impetus for feminist theorizing in Indian Ocean studies, more specifically, has further been reflected in the recent formation of the Feminist Futures in the Indian Ocean cluster at UC Santa Cruz. And here, with reference to Nidhi Mahajan's work, who is luckily also here, of course, which serves as, which is intended as a reaction to the lack of explicitly, as they state, feminist scholarship in Indian Ocean studies, and by way of centering subaltern histories and embodied knowledges to deprioritize the male gaze in the study of the sea. And finally, I take key inspiration in thinking about feminist aesthetic practice and oceanic space from the German Arch Plus magazine for architecture and urbanism that dedicated a whole issue in 2022 to what they framed as contemporary feminist spatial practice. In the editorial, Melissa Koch and Anne Lingon ask, I translate from German, how formations of social injustice are intertwined through various spatial dimensions, which I suggest we may easily apply to the Indian Ocean. And they ask further how architecture as a discipline that continues to be strongly shaped by patriarchal power hierarchies and exploitative relationships can realize a new promise of freedom that, at its core, represents a transformative idea of justice, and must, as a discipline, contribute and commit to fulfilling a promise of liberation for all people, a question we again may ask ourselves in regard to our respective positionalities. If we now pair this theoretical approach that prioritizes aesthetics by way of artful practices and sensual experiences with the quests of including erased histories and inaudible voices, subaltern experiences and embodied knowledges, and a commitment to social justice and liberation as intertwined with space, the intersectional and decolonizing claims at the heart of all these recent feminist framings, then we arrive at the notion that I propose to think of as feminist aesthetic space, that decidedly politicizes aesthetic practice and experience, as well as oceanic spatial thinking, by asking questions of exclusion and distribution, in order to acknowledge entrenched silences and persisting challenges to rehabilitating marginalized stories. Now, moving from these grounds to thinking with Himid's contemporary painting practice, I suggest we gain insight into precisely such a feminist aesthetic practice and aesthetic activism that has long delineated the Indian Ocean as a feminist aesthetic space, and I suggest should more thoroughly inform ongoing re-theorizations across Indian Ocean studies. Himid's works have long featured depictions of oceans and water as backdrop, mainly to scenes of women's lives, and specifically also before she began explicitly engaging with aspects of her Swahili heritage when she was already in her 40s. The sea as a consistent part of women's spatiality for her came before that. Thank you. Instead of sailors, gliding dhows, or scenes of arrival and departure in oceanic trading ports, Himid offers us large-scale paintings which often show women characters in situations with the sea. In Act 1, No Maps, from 1992, we find ourselves in a theater box, alongside two black female protagonists who gaze over what appears to be an empty stage, past a red curtain that half covers a turquoise and blue background. Looking again, we may also see these two women aboard and at the front of a vessel with a red sail, observing, despite in different directions, the waves of a stormy ocean. The multiple ways of seeing what Himid presents us with are a strategy she operates with through her art that leaves the audience guessing, unsettled, in regard to what it is we are really seeing. Act 1, as possible beginning or a turning point, a reconsideration of what it may mean to think with no maps that fall as ripped up paper from the two women's hands. This presentation of two active and reconfiguring subjects that refuse the maps of their world and the knowledge of their histories they have been presented with may be, as Bernier has put it, ideally placed to generate alternative memoirs and new narratives of Black diasporic lives. In Between the Two, My Heart is Balanced, from 1991, a painting from the same series titled Revenge, several aspects encountered in Act 1 No Maps echo. In Himid's own words, this painting was an attempt to show, quote, that we all have subtly different strategies from each other. We appear to be doing the same thing, but are not. The woman on the left in the painting is taking navigation charts from the pile that separates them. The two women then rip these up, discarding the fragments. The other woman is ripping up maps and engaging with the rower of the boat, the audience, end quote. Himid's very individualized subjects, or what she herself calls the device of placing two Black women in a painting together, is devoted to, as she emphasizes, counteract this assumption that there was only one story and that the Black woman never spoke. It positions itself against an assumption that women always work for one similar cause, and instead recenters a multiplicity inherent within presumably heterogeneous groups. Then there is the Zanzibar series of 9 double paintings from the late 1990s, which is, as Himid explains herself, a series of paintings made about a journey. And she writes, first, there was the journey I made from Zanzibar to England in 1954 with my mother after the death of my father. The second journey has been the years spent painting works that were and were not Zanzibar. The third journey was a visit I made in 1997, when I discovered that I had indeed been painting the place, the sound, and the memory of the islands all along. This next journey has been the making of these paintings, an exercise in speed, daring, calm, and panic, end quote. The artworks include, with Himid's words, paintings of clubs, of rain, of closed shutters. There are paintings of the sea, of fishing nets, death from malaria, of which, for example, in Women's Tears, fill the ocean from 1999, 2 years after her first visit to Zanzibar, the visible women protagonists of the works shift shape and appear through the affective aspects ascribed to them as their tears. Himid notes that the thinly applied paint, sometimes green, sometimes pink or gray, drips, splashes, and falls endlessly in monochrome tears in painting after painting, and that it helped her to, as she says, understand the consistent themes of melancholy, fear, of flight, and unresolved unbelonging present in most of her pieces. Her concern with the sea, she writes, stems partially from her personal history as well as the reading of narratives about and by people taken forcibly from the African shores. I'll skip this. With the notions of fear and unbelonging central here, the Zanzibar series that reflects Himid's fear of and obsession with the sea shines a light on that part of female ocean journeys, both personal and political, voluntary and not so, that form a critical current to understandings of the sea beyond male memories of trade and torment, and extending to places away from the more thorough, documented, and visible women's histories being central here. It allows us to shift to effective dimensions embodied through, caused by, and related to the Indian Ocean, to what the sea and its depiction does to people physically and psychologically, or to what it comes to stand for. Then there's Himid's more recent body of works from 2019, in which the sea has become less central. Now it is either lurking in, sometimes appearing to haunt the protagonists. At the center of the paintings are now the actions and operations of the subjects at stake. In Three Architects, we see these subjects working out their own vision while sharing a space and an ocean stretching across the view of the horizon, the floor appearing as a changing shore. And in the operating table, the audience this time takes a seat at a table with, again, a constellation of different women who, unlike the Three Architects, interact more obviously, yet hesitantly, with each other, deep in discussion and potential disagreement over a map that includes a body of water, developing what Amrita Tallu has helpfully termed an embodied governance of land, and I suggest potentially also of the sea. And I'll skip this. So, what do I suggest these insights may tell us about thinking the Indian Ocean as a feminist aesthetic space? And I return to the questions I set out to think with. As Himid's practice has shown us in her long featuring engagement with the sea as a space of unmapping and renavigating both the collaboration and refusal of the women protagonists in it, the multivocality and the remaking of trauma and embodied memory, the idea of thinking with the ocean as feminist aesthetic practice, as feminist aesthetic space, makes a case for more robustly and inclusively considering as a starting point beyond concepts those aspects of history that need to be understood through their embodied and effective dimensions, through their central and aesthetic worlds. Above all, it implies a critique and a commitment to thinking with a certain set of questions that refuse the omission or neglect of specifically gendered, classed, and racialized experiences and emotions as part of Indian Ocean subjectivities. So as I set out to do, I suggest that such a framing may expand Van and Van's notion of understanding the Indian Ocean as aesthetic space and as imagined by those who live it to also reflect the less visible historical processes and experiences they relate to. Feminist aesthetics, as long mapped and made visible by political artists like Himid, could serve here as such a kind of a refusal. I'll skip this. Now, a tide change towards an endless ocean, as Himid's practice suggests to us, may thus lie in the potential to understand her painting practice, in her own words, as being about filling in the gaps in something, that something, well, being our disciplines. This framing may also move forward the claim of Srinivas, Ngueno, and Jayachandran to think afresh with new units of analysis or keywords towards epistemic shifts within and across Indian Ocean worlds. And we see this further reflected in feminist approaches to ethnography as they are voiced throughout my discipline of anthropology. So by zooming in on this selection of Himid's paintings, I've tried to show the multiple ways in which her notion of an engagement with the sea and its gendered relationality are ever present and deeply entangled with each other and offer themselves as untapped potential to endeavors of disordering and interrupting Indian Ocean narratives. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for an amazing presentation. So I can only bring up what's being said here. So I only had Francis's paper, so I don't know, So I'll bring up whatever was presented here, just little points, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So hopefully more questions would come. And Lubaina's work is at the Sharjah Art Foundation, right? Sharjah Art Foundation people, it's still on, right? Huh? Okay, so it's at the Sharjah Art Foundation. We have people here, the vice president of the Sharjah Art Foundation and the two curators here. So Lubaina's work is there. So hopefully everybody will see it, curated by Sharjah Art Foundation. Per curator Omar Khalef. It's a fascinating work, and she was here only a few weeks ago. So anyway, let me bring up certain things, and then we'll open it up for discussion. I'm not an Indian Ocean scholar, but if you read, the Sharjah Biennale 15 that happened a few months ago was the most amazing biennale that was conducted here, and most artists focused on the Indian Ocean. The special issue on Inca that just came out in November, I tried to tackle some of those artists that were exhibited at Kalba, who worked on the Dhow. And I used, of course, Nidhi Mahajan's work here on the Dhow. So if you have, please pick up Inca and see not only my article, but a lot of articles on there on Indian Ocean artists. Having said that, I just want to start with Franziska, maybe. Just quoting my favorite sociologist, Ian Chambers, who works on the other sea, the Mediterranean. So he talks about the sea is not merely a dialectical negation of the ground beneath our feet. It's something more than that. It breaks away from simply being an aquatic emptiness, contrasted to the fullness of the land. Although claimed, administered, and resourced by all the powers and technologies of modernity, from trade and tourism to energy supplies and pharmacological research, we can choose to insist that the sea promotes an irreducible alterity. So that's Ian Chambers. So Franziska, I think it's this alterity that you try to bring out in Lubaina's work. So as you say, an Indian Ocean knowledge production that's more in the present contemporary moment and its associated practices. So her paintings, you focus on her paintings, moving the field into the present moment and out of the older archives, as you say. While Jodie, and from your abstract and from your talk today, so you frame women as essential contributors to the shaping of Western Indian Ocean cultures, and you base your research on interviews in Unguja, Pemba, and Greater Muscat. So it explores women's critical roles in Arab Swahili cultural development, and it draws examples from the past century of Omani-Zanzibar history to counter the prevailing male-focused narrative. So you go back to the archive to understand how this history was represented contemporary at the moment, right? At the present moment. So what does this mean for both of you? What's the role of the archive here to bring out silenced histories? We're talking about silenced histories now, right? It is the archive that complicates the present as well, right? So our contemporary moment. So engagement with the archive is also necessary, no? So it is the terms of engagement we should problematize, I think. So if you can talk about that both of you, Franziska and Jodie. And then you brought up, at the end, you brought up a question, which women to include, both in the contemporary moment and from the archive too. So that's a big problem for the histories of silence. This is currently what I'm working on now. So which women are we including? And then for you, I just wanted to, it's very fascinating. I didn't know anything about the queen there, the portraiture, and their sitter's interiority is very, very important. But I just wanted to find out, and you talked about how, the representation changed from like images of royalty to caricatures and stuff. So have you studied it with other colonial photography type of images? The same things happened. For example, like an Ethiopian monk who went to Italy and France in the 15th century, accepted as royalty, and all these images come out, and then right after the transatlantic slavery, he becomes caricatured and ridiculed. So it'd be nice to just compare, just to look at it with other colonial photography, histories of other colonial photography. So that's all I have, and then we can open it up to the floor. So who can I start with?
I'll just briefly touch on the comparative examples. I think in continuing to think through this project and representations of Djoumbé Fatima, I've been very inspired by and interested in both contemporaneous and also kind of slightly preceding like representations of Malagasy royals, because there's a really interesting way in which, because the French colonial project in Comoros was so intrinsically linked with that in Madagascar, it was almost kind of seen as like a stepping stone to kind of this bigger, more resource-rich island. Often there's even a portrait that I didn't include here that shows Djoumbé Fatima kind of in, I think, 1863, pictured right next to a different portrait of another Malagasy royal who was sort of this prince of Nosy-Be. And and so it's like there's a lot of really, there's kind of very literal ways in which those things are interlocking. And so I think as I continue to work on this, I have no choice but to look at other representations of royal figures, especially since they were sort of the French colonial project really saw them as the entry point into these places. But thank you for that comment. It's really helpful and generative.
Yeah, I think the thought about archives is a very relevant one, partially because an archive is I guess essentially an artifact of what at one point someone thought was important for history. And that's not necessarily what people in the future or even the present think would be interesting or important. So we don't tend to get deep reflections on the interior lives of working class women recorded in the colonial archives of Zanzibar, for example. That's just not a thing that's there. So it becomes a question of reading the silences, both of those archival sources, but then also if we think of the oral history as its own type of constructed archive, what the various barriers there are, both in terms of who's still alive, but also who is willing to speak to some researcher who wants to ask intrusive questions about their private lives, which for the sake of my project, I was very interested in the lives of women, but frequently it wasn't necessarily women who were willing to speak to me. So I ended up speaking to quite a lot of men about their mothers and their grandmothers' lives. But then there again, we have that barrier that we have to find ways to reach past, which requires some active thought about both how we're reading those interviews, but also how we're constructing our questions. Because if we just ask about your family in Oman, well, then it might be their founding father who came from Oman. But the fact that your mother was also from Oman, or all that your mother did to try to keep in touch after this connection was no longer quite so tangible in their lives, kind of disappears if you don't continue to ask about specifically for the woman's experience. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for your comments. I think you said it yourself. I mean, it is really not about like engaging with archives, yes or no. It's so much about the question of how. How do we engage with it? How do we imagine and think of what the archive or an archive can even be? So my approach is more to really think in more inclusive or expansive ways about that, and to think also with contemporary artistic practice as aesthetic activism, as with Lubaina's works, to be a part of that, and to write it into it, and to acknowledge it as necessary grounding for theorizing. So to not only think of theorizing as coming out of academia, but to think of theorizing as very much grounded in experiences, and those expressed particularly along aesthetic expressions. And your comment about exactly which women to include, I think particularly speaking from anthropology, this question of whether to center women, of course, like we've actually long moved beyond that. So to really think more in terms of, again, marginalized experiences that across different intersections are not centered, and those not, of course, only being women or women's experiences, but to think more of the margins and of non-included life experiences as very necessary in terms of still needing centering, but that definitely not only pertaining to the woman as neglected figure. Yeah.
Okay, I'll open it up to discussion. Any question? Meg?
I actually don't know if this is a question yet. Thank you all for your papers. I'm thinking a little bit about how Franziska and Jodie's papers talk to each other. And particularly what I'm struck by is the figure of the map, or the idea of the map that keeps returning in Lubaina Himid's work. And then I'm thinking about the interlocutors that you're working with, Jodie, kind of creating or searching for a map back to their relatives in Oman, and these two. See, this is how it's not a question yet, because I'm still, but I was necessarily also thinking about the Kenyan author Yvonne Adhiambo-Owor's novels, and also her scholarly work on maps and the map making in Swahili poetic history, and she's sort of locating maps of what she calls the Swahili seas, right, of the Indian Ocean, in poetry. Although it occurs to me also that a lot of those poems, I mean, she's thinking with male poets. So, but she's writing a protagonist then in her novel who is a young girl, kind of resurrecting or creating her own map. So, for lack of a better question, I'm just wondering if you could both comment on this idea of the map and how useful it is to each of you thinking about your projects, about this idea of an aesthetic space. You know, is it more about creating maps, destroying? I feel like there's figures of destruction. Anyway, so that's my ill-formed question for you.
You guys have any comments? You don't have to. She just commented on, but.
Yeah, thank you, Meg. Yeah, of course, very, very directly relating to Yvonne's work, and like with her work specifically, again, this notion of an embodied map, of maps and mapping being a performative act, of being performed through poetry, carried with you, not written or not in the form or the format that it appears to us as naturalized, but that does not necessarily need to be the only one. So again, for me, in my understanding, very much this question of inclusivity and of thinking of mapping or unmapping in the way that we know it, and thinking of this thing that we call the map as also other things.
Yeah, I lost track of what your question was, but I really like the way you phrased the women are searching for a map back to their kin and their connections. It makes me think of the ways that that people maybe can act as maps for each other in the sense that they are, searching for have you seen this? Do you know where this is? And maybe they do, maybe they don't. But that I feel like that's how a lot of this kind of interpersonal mapping of where the families are and where these connections are, how that actually happens in day-to-day life is through these interpersonal connections between people.
Okay, any more questions? Come on, guys. Okay, wait, Prita, you're the organizer, so I'll give. Who's there? I can't see. Okay, whoever it is, I can't see your face, but go ahead. Oh, okay, go ahead.
Hi. Thank you so much for excellent presentations. My name is Sitari Nourani. I'm from Rotterdam, Nieuwe Instituut Rotterdam. And I have a question. Actually, it's something that I've been meditating on myself in my own research. How might new materialist thinking help us here, like in thinking about bodies of water, and in particular taking from the hydrofeminism that Astrida Neymanis quotes as, to think of embodiment as watery belies the understanding of bodies that we have inherited from the dominant Western metaphysical tradition. As watery, we experience ourselves as less as isolated entities and more as oceanic eddies. So yeah, perhaps I'm just curious how to think of the body and of the feminist body as water.
Hydrofeminism.
Yes.
This is the first time I'm hearing about it. So you guys, you want to take a stab? You want to take a stab at it? Or?
I can't specifically speak to that, but it's a beautiful comment. Thank you for bringing that up. I mean, there's so much theoretical engagement in really also trying to make sense from so many different points of view and like from and across fields and theories. So that is another additional one that, of course, this is not a competition in terms of which one can frame it better. But I think thinking with specifically, again, this other notion that you're bringing up, more materialist notions that very actively center the body and physical experience as telling of journeys, as telling of maps, as telling of histories, and particularly of the central escape and sensation that is so closely intertwined with that and so hard to grasp or publish in words is, yeah, very much rooted in that, and I think a helpful addition. So thank you.
You want to, Jodie? No, you don't have
Sure. This is probably not what you were talking about, but here's another thought. I've actually feel like I've spent quite a lot of time and energy over the past few years arguing that these transnational communities are actually less fluid and more viscous and lumpy than we tend to imagine them. And the ways that certain communities, women, working class people, people in rural areas, etc., are not excluded. They're very much still a part of the transnational community, but don't have that easy fluidity of movement that we like to imagine. So I don't know if that pushes back against what you were saying about hydrofeminism or if it agrees with it, but it's certainly another way we use this metaphor of water and of fluidity to imagine a feminist transnational space.
Yeah, I think my paper doesn't deal with that question kind of directly, but I think in terms of the method that I'm trying to undertake, I'm having the challenging experience of both kind of reconstructing this, not reconstructing, people have certainly written about and thought about Djoumbé Fatima, but I think in trying to piece together these visual representations, I have a hard time kind of juggling between the very concrete, factual sort of placement of this figure in space and time, by being like, she was in this studio at this time, she went to this city at this point, and there's a lot of really kind of breathless accounts of her movements during this trip. And I think in kind of reconstructing that narrative and that trajectory, I have a hard time with the idea of kind of concretizing knowledge in that way, but then also trying to imagine outside of that, if that makes sense. So it's a tension that I feel kind of keeps coming up in the work.
Thank you so much for your papers. I actually wanted to follow up on a point, Jodie, that you just made, which I thought was just so fascinating, to help me concretize the question I wanted to put towards Franziska and Kinaya. You know, your point about that we sort of tend to have this sort of, very almost rosy or celebratory narrative about mobilities and diaspora and movement. But your paper so nicely shows us that movement can be actually done through other agents, right? That you can give that power because you yourself can't travel to someone else to continue to nurture the ties that bind. I thought that was so insightful. And it's actually a really nice way to then ask Franziska and Kinaya to compare or to think actually of Lubaina, Himid, and Queen Fatima as historical figures, of course in different time periods, who are seeking to represent or are oftentimes represented in certain ways in relationship to their mobility or immobility, right? You could say that if you think of, again, this is not your project, Franziska, but if you think of Lubaina Himid not as a sort of agent to help you theorize something, right, but as a historical figure, right, who is moving across oceans in similar ways as Queen Fatima, right, that there is this interesting, on one hand, of course, an elite mobility, right, but they're also, through their role as women, right, they're juggling other ways that they're forced into immobility, if that makes sense. So those, in some ways, this is not a question, but maybe something to ask you to respond to. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Preeta. Absolutely, I think that's a brilliant way of connecting the two. I think that's very helpful, and I mean, for the way that I understand Lubaina Himid's work, what I find impressive about her body of work is that she has, for such a long time, really not actively engaged with this sense of portraying or even fetishizing her own history in a way that we often, even if unintentionally, tend to do as a person of mobility, a person of this specific network. But she only, coming into her 40s, traveled for the first time to Zanzibar and then made her engagement with all of these aesthetic, different categories that are so visibly linked to the East African region, more overt, or really plays on them now, but that came later. And what came first was this engagement with water. And I think that is something that really stands out and that also grounds the work very differently and is thus so informative too, thinking what water or what oceans do to portrayals of history.
Yeah, I really appreciate that comment because it's really, it helps crystallize something that I've been trying to work through with Djoumbé Fatima, and I think kind of similar to this question of sort of what purposes does one's identity kind of get conscripted into. I think with the kind of contemporary memory of Djoumbé Fatima, there's a lot of, at least among kind of the Comorian diaspora and then other sort of, on social media, she'll get posted, people will post her image as like this historic, like Black Muslim queen who fought against colonialism. And I think I'm very interested in her, like, there's this sort of, yeah, she's kind of a floating signifier in a lot of ways for what people desire and what people want to kind of put onto her and kind of imagine out of just by virtue of who she was. And yeah, I don't know, your comment just provoked so many things. I think a lot about, like, again, this kind of coalescing of Comorian identity when at that moment she wouldn't have probably even had the vocabulary to understand herself in that way. So there's just a lot of really interesting kind of temporal crossings that you experience when trying to write about someone, a person, and because I'm also mobilizing her for my own purposes as well. So I think we face similar issues in kind of revolving around one person to try and advance a particular idea. So thank you.
But that's an interesting question. But this is, I mean, Lubaina left when she was 2 years old. She left, or 2, or I don't know. She left Zanzibar when she was very young, and she lived all her life in London, right, in the UK. So still going back to that ocean memory. So she's really digging into, like every diaspora, I guess, you know, so the archive of memory. She's going back to the water over and over again, right? Even though she's living in another, you know, in another realm right now. So anyway, it's interesting. One more question, and we can go to lunch. I didn't see, oh, Nidhi, do you have any question? Okay, go ahead. Go ahead. Nidhi.
Thank you. Thank you so much for these incredible set of papers. I mean, I think you've already sort of answered this, but I guess Kinaya, just kind of thinking, I'm fascinated by, you know, Djoumbé, Fatima, and the circulation of the images, and this question of method that you're grappling with, right? How do you read her in the diaspora? How do you read her in the Comoros and in different historical moments, right? So in terms of methodology, apart from the photographs, right, what other entry points exist, or what other entry points can one use to narrativize not just the colonial imagination or the contemporary imagination of this figure, but her in the Comoros and situating her within, you know, within that? Are there epic poems? Like, what are the possible kind of archives that exist, or other ways of reading her, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think so far, yeah, so much of what I've been able, or what I felt like I've been able to say has centered around these French archives specifically, and that were produced on the mainland in response to her visit. And yeah, I really don't have a good answer to that really, really productive question. I think this summer when I was in Comoros, and I would just kind of go around and be like, oh, I'm writing this thing about Djoumbé Fatima, people, like, their eyes would light up. They'd be like, oh, Djoumbé Fatima, like, this is someone who is known, but like you know, I don't know how factually correct this is, but when I was on the island of U.A.E, like, people were, I think apparently the ruins of her palace had been razed, and so there's sort of like almost a void. I don't want to say that exactly, but just in terms of a physical material archive, yeah, I have yet to kind of come across that, you know, in Comoros. And I think, again, it kind of really compounds the challenge of writing about her. Yeah, there's really interesting also, like, you know, there's a French writer who wrote like a historical fiction kind of novel about her, and that I think was published in collaboration with a Comorian publisher. And so there's really interesting ways in which people are, again, sort of mobilizing archival materials to tell a story. And I think, I don't know, I don't really know where that fits into my work yet, because this is all still, you know, very much a fluid and ever-changing topic. But I don't know. Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that question. It gives me a lot to work with in the future.
Okay, oh, one more, okay.
Hello, my name is Sonja Filzmeier, and I have a question about Fatima again. Because I'm surprised during this time that we have the photographs and the engravings, and I wonder if there are any paintings, because at that time you would still expect paintings to be commissioned. And then the fact that there are photographs, which is a rather newer medium, and the possibility to widespread her image through the engravings and also through the publications. I find that quite fascinating, but I would have expected that there might be a painting as well.
Yeah, I haven't encountered one yet. I don't know if there are any that are extant today, or whether there had been any, like I haven't come across any mentioning of anything in an archive of like, maybe it doesn't exist now, but someone had created one at the time. I know there are examples of Zanzibari sultans, for instance, like, you know, British naval admirals who came and painted some of them. So yeah, that's an interesting point, because I've encountered it in that context, but not in the specific case of Djoumbé Fatima. Yeah, but I think it speaks to, again, the you know, kind of rapid fire way in which photography had caught on in the region, and then also in France also. And I don't know, I think it's really, it's a story both of technological development and like intermedial sort of translation that's happening with the portraits, which I find really compelling. Yeah, so I think it's in a lot of sense, the absence of paintings helps kind of support that story. So thank you.
Emery, I have to close. What, do you have an important question? Okay, the last one. That's the last one. No more questions.
Thank you, Kinaya. So, I mean, I like the way you read the pictures, so we can see the power of this description. So you mentioned the interiority. So methodologically, I want to know, how do you kind of access that interiority, you know, especially when you're reading the picture, without the person telling you exactly their feelings or, you know, their thinking at that specific moment?
You imagine, you reimagine.
I think that's exactly the thing I'm trying to dance around in this paper. I think as much as I'm trying to read, you know, sort of the ambiguous and kind of enigmatic, you know, presence of Djoumbé Fatima in these photographs, I hesitate to like ascribe certain feelings. Like it's hard because at certain moments, because we know that certain things happened in certain, like, you know, at certain points in time, and we can pinpoint those exact dates and line them up with when portraits were taken, you can maybe guess what her state of mind might have been, especially in the aftermath of sort of this land crisis that she had ended up in, and that, you know, took her all the way to France. So one can imagine, and especially because we also have record of these personal relationships, there's a level of like, I don't know, I'm also feeling this tug of war of like stopping just before I want to kind of speculate on her state of mind. And if anything, I think it's been really productive to kind of really just rest with the images and what those do and do not tell us. Because this question of interiority is so elusive that I really get nervous about trying to narrate what she might have been thinking and feeling. But thank you, I really, you know, it's something I keep coming back to.
In contemporary trendy scholarship, you critically fabulate those images and reconstruct silent stitches. Anyway, thank you so much. A very amazing paper on women, feminist futures, and I even heard about hydrofeminism today, which I'm going to dig in. I don't even understand African feminism yet, but we have to go into a hydrofeminism. Anyway.